Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Prita Bhattacharya from the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today, the paper under discussion is Social and Cultural History of India from the earliest times to 707, and our focus will be on the impact of the heretical sects on Indian society. The objectives of this module is to know about the operations of the heterodox sects in the Middle Ganga Valley, to learn about the nature of relationship between the sects and the wider society, and also to know about the far-reaching impact of the sects in the early historical period. As you know, this period from 6th century BCE around 5th century BCE, this period is an important landmark in early Indian history because this is the time when far-reaching changes were taking place in the sphere of polity, in the sphere of society, and also in the sphere of culture. As you know, during this period, state polities and societies emerged, and it emerged in a vast area stretching from Gandhara in the northwest to Anga in eastern India. We also have the name of a great state, Asaka, which was situated in the upper Godavari valley. This state has been mentioned in the Buddhist text Anguttara Nikaya. This name suggests that similar processes were underway in parts of Trans-Vindhyan India as well, though it was happening in a smaller way. As we discuss the context, we also have to mention that urban settlements were coming up, but we also have a notion of the settlement hierarchies from the literary sources. The urban settlements were surrounded usually by agrarian villages and also by vast stretches of forests. There was also a proliferation of settlements of different sizes, and there is evidence of intensified craft production. We also have evidence of towns emerging. Some of the towns were emerging at the nodal points of trade routes. In that way, we understand that trade was gaining momentum in this period. As we look at the sources, we, for the first time, are confronted with a plethora of texts which can be compared with each other. We have the Buddhist texts. Among the Buddhist texts, we have the Nikayas, parts of which can be assigned to a very early period from about 5th century BCE to 3rd century BCE. We also have the Vinaya Pitaka, which is also quite old and can be dated within the same time bracket. We also have the Jataka stories. We have some problems dating the Jatakas, but we can most definitely say that some of the stories at least go back to the age of the Buddha. We also have Puranas as source, but as you know, the Puranas were compiled much later. But as the Puranas look back to an earlier period, these texts can be used as sources as well. We also have the Grija Sutras and the Dharma Sutras, the earliest of the Grija Sutras and the Dharma Sutras, which were being formed, which were taking shape during this period. And of course, we have the Jain texts. Most important of them was, of course, the Bhagavati Sutra, which is a very early text. As far as archaeological sources are concerned, in North India, the cultural marker that distinguished the early historical sites is a distinctive pottery which has been named as the Northern Black Polished Ware. And this kind of pottery is being associated with the early historic sites. Now, we move on to our discussion about the heterodox sects that emerged during that period. The name heterodox is a bit complex because it conveys a set of meanings that are quite obscure for us if we use modern terms. When we look at the context, we have a proliferation of the urban centers and communities which is marked by distinctions of class and caste, and also this was also the age of the renunciates who advocated giving up attachment to all material things and who were also distancing themselves from the forces of social production and who were also shying away from the new kinds of social relationships that were taking shape. Renunciates are referred to by various names, like the Paribhajaka, the one who wandered about, the Samana, and the Bhikkhu. The main features that characterized these groups were celibacy, mendicancy. They had to live, they had to sustain themselves by begging, and wandering. They could not settle at one place. According to the Buddhist texts, during this period, throughout the entire region, there were at least 82 sects, but there are different sources which enumerate them variously. These sects were mainly based in the Middle Ganga Valley, especially beyond the pale of the Vedic orthodoxy and roughly corresponding to the modern states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. The Anguttara Nikaya mentions 6 prominent teachers who were founders of orders. Now you see the difference between the earlier Vedic shakhas, who were loosely organized, who were often small groups or lone ascetics. But here we have organized sanghas based on an institutional basis. There was an awareness of shared culture between the sects, as also an atmosphere of rivalry and competition for patronage from the newly emergent propertied categories like the Setti and the Gahapati. The royal houses of Koshal and Magad also supported the heterodox sects, as did the Gana Sanghas. Now, the prominent heterodox groups were the Charvakas, the Lokayatas. Sometimes people use these terms interchangeably, but these two terms were merged much later. Then we have the Ajivikas, the Jains, and the Buddhists. Before we embark on the operations of the Charvakas, we have to understand what the concept of Nastika meant in ancient India. The word Nastika here does not mean atheists, but refer to those who did not subscribe to the authority and infallibility of Vedic tradition. The Buddhists, the Jains, the Charvakas and Lokayatas, they all challenged the authority of the Vedas. That is why they were labeled as Nastikas, not because they were atheists. Now first take up the Charvakas. The first thing that comes to mind about the Charvakas is that they were rank materialists. The Charvakas considered the sages or the ascetics' practice of smearing the body with sacred ash as an act of the foolish. The Charvaka logic raised the question that if the sacrificed animal in the Jagga was supposed to have gone to heaven, then why the sacrificer would not sacrifice his own father to ensure his heavenly abode? However, as we know, Charvaka as an organized school of thought emerged much later. The Lokayatas, if we take them as being different from the Charvakas, the Lokayata doctrine strongly upheld that man was made of 4 elements, and after his death, earth returns to the aggregate of earth, water to water, fire to fire, and air to air, and his senses vanish into space. So this is the notion of Dehatmavada, that there is no independent soul outside the body and nothing survives after death. After the Charvakas and the Lokayatas, we have the Ajivikas, who believed in the doctrine of niyati or determinism. They believed that every single act, however small it is preordained. The Jaina texts viewed them as champions of inaction. The problem is we have no surviving Ajivika texts, and Ajivika history is known to us from the gleanings about this sect from the Buddhists and Jain texts who were their rivals. So they often paint a very derogatory picture of the Ajivikas. The most important figure of the Ajivikas was Makkali Gosala, as we learn from the Pali texts. He was named after his father's profession of a monka or bard. Gosala for a while pursued his father's profession, but subsequently he renounced the world. Jain texts state that at one time Mahavira and Gosala were very close. But as time progressed, they fell out and they became bitter critics of each other. Buddhist texts, however, refer to 2 predecessors of Makkali Gosala, namely Nandavacha and Kisasankicha. According to Buddhist tradition, Ajivika monks contemporary to the Buddha were Purana Kassapa and Pakudha Kachayana. Since the Ajivikas believed in destiny and preordained nature of every act, Purana Kassapa did not recognize any difference between merit and sin and morality and immorality. As we have learned, the Ajivikas were quite close to Jainism in matters of doctrine and also of practice. The most renowned figure in Jainism is, of course, Mahavira, though he was, according to the Jaina tradition, the last and the 24th of the Tirthankaras. The first Tirthankara was Rishabhanatha or Adinatha. The last two Tirthankaras, Parshvanatha and Mahavira, were most certainly historical figures. Parshva laid down 4 fundamental principles of the Jaina way of life. The first is, of course, ahimsa. Second is satya, sunrita. Asteya is non-stealing. And aparigraha, that is not possessing any articles. Mahavira added the vow of brahmacharya. We have a hagiography of Mahavira pieced together from different sources. He was born tentatively around 539 BCE. We have the name of his father, Siddhartha, and his mother, Trisala, who both hailed from non-monarchical clans. His name prior to his renunciation was Vardhamana, but he married, and then after a daughter was born, he renounced his household life and set forth on his wanderings. He is said to have renounced the world at the age of 30 and attained the supreme knowledge, Kevala, at the age of 42. The Jainas are also known as Nirgranthas, or those who severed all ties. 8 months of the year, Mahavira spent by wandering and preaching, and the rest of the 4 months were the months of monsoon retreat, when he usually sojourned at various cities like Champa, Rajabriha, Mithila, Shravasti, and so on and so forth. Mahavira, after his death, Mahavira was followed by 2 Ganadharas, Indrabhuti Gautama and Sudharma, each heading the Jaina monastic organization for 12 years. Then during Bhadravahu's stewardship, that is around the Mauryan period, Jaina community experienced its first major schism as they were divided into two major sects, the Shvetambara and the Digambara sects. Now, last but not the least, we come to Buddhism, which is one of the most social religions in early Indian history and had the biggest impact on the wider society of early historical period. Though from the historical sources and from the Pali texts especially, we have Buddha as the most prominent figure in Buddhism. It is in the own words of Buddha that there were many Buddhas in the past and many Buddhas would follow him in the future. We also have a kind of hagiography that we have for Mahavira, but these are bits and pieces, fragments, which we have to weave together to build up a sequential narrative. But we know that he was born in Lumbini, in the present Nepalese Tarai, and just as Mahavira, he also hailed from a non-monarchical Gono type of polity called the Shakyas. And he lost his mother soon after his birth, and he was brought up by his foster mother and aunt, Mahapajapati Gotami, and hence he became known as Gotama. The early life of Gautama, as we know from the hagiography, was typical of the Kshatriya prince of a chiefly clan of the times. He married and became the father of a son, Rahul. But despite all the comforts and luxuries of life, he was forever dissatisfied, distressed, and by the inevitable miseries of old age, disease, and death. Attainment of enlightenment was, of course, Bodh Gaya, and this event in his life became known as Sambadhi or enlightenment. Then he moved on to Sarnath, which is near Banaras, and here he gathered together 5 disciples and he preached. He gave his first sermon at the deer park at Sarnath, and this act was memorialized in the Buddhist tradition as the turning of the wheel of law. The most important event in Buddhist history is, of course, the setting up of the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddhist monastery, and of course the rules, the vinayas associated with monastic life. Buddha was one of the first, though he did it after much negotiations, he was the first to admit nuns into the monasteries. He devoted the rest of his life to the preaching of his creed and wandered to different places in the Middle Ganga plains, attracting a large number of followers from all walks of life. His followers, if we look at the social composition of the early Buddhist laity, we'll find mention of Brahmanas and members of the royal family, the Settis, the Gahapatis who had large landed estates. We have mention of the craftsmen, ordinary people, even robbers and prostitutes who thronged to listen to the advices of the Buddha. At the age of 80, tentatively at around 483 BCE, after having eaten his last meal at the invitation of a blacksmith, he breathed his last, and this is known as Mahaparinirvana in Buddhist tradition. He died at Kushinagara. As we look at the philosophy, the core of the philosophy that the Buddha taught, the first thing that strikes us is, of course, the theory of dukkha or the all-enveloping phenomenon of suffering, which was at the root of all human existence and experience. The Buddha diagnosed that the worldly experience was full of profound sorrow, a concept which is of foundational significance in the Buddhist doctrine. He further analyzed the causes that led to that kind of suffering. He diagnosed that the root of all suffering is the insatiable thirst or desire to acquire objects and to reach goals, which the Buddha perceived as the cause of interminable cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The entire argument is based on the concept of the chain of causation. Based on this all-enveloping nature of suffering or dukkha, the cardinal thesis of Buddhism took shape, and Buddha preached the nature of the Four Noble Truths: dukkha or suffering, dukkha samudaya, which is the causes that lead to suffering, dukkha nirodha, how suffering could be staved off, and the atthanga magga, which are the paths to evade suffering. Nirvana is not very clearly stated in the Buddhist philosophy, but it is hinted at through other kinds of concepts like ajara, beyond decay, avyadhi, beyond affliction, amrita, beyond death, anuttara, which means incomparable. Attainment of nirvana is extremely difficult and requires passing through several stages and which spanned over many lives. Sees the inner openness and democracy of Buddhism because each and every individual was theoretically capable of attaining nirvana if they passed through the appropriate stages. One of the factors that led to the immensely popular appeal of the new idea was the Buddha's advocacy for moderation. That means extreme asceticism was not required. I have already explained that Buddhism was a most social religion. To overcome sufferings, the Buddha preferred a middle course or Majjhima Patha to the extremities of sensuous lifestyle and ultimate asceticism, which emphasized on inflicting pain on the body. Atthanga magga, as we know, is like this: right views, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. After the Buddha passed away, the teachings of the Buddha had to be codified and transmitted through certain channels. And these channels were taking shape in the Buddhist councils that took place after the demise of the Buddha. The first Buddhist council was convened at Rajagriha under the presidentship of Mahakasapa. The Chullavagga of the Vinaya Pitaka informs us that the Sangha suffered from internal dissensions and breaches of discipline. Hence, the need was felt to codify the teaching of the Buddha into canons. So, Buddhist literature was slowly being canonized after the demise of the Buddha. The Buddha always used to preach orally, and his teachings were committed to writing long after his death. The first Buddhist council is noted for the compilation and codification of the Vinayas and the Sutta Pitakas. After a century had elapsed since the parinirvana of the Buddha, the second Buddhist council was held in Vaisali. This council was marked by severe internal dissensions, mainly between the Eastern Buddhist monks and the Western Buddhist monks. The Eastern monks, or the Vajiputtakas, were declared as detrimental to the Sangha, and they were more or less expelled. Then the Vajiputaka monks convened a separate assembly and endorsed all the 10 tainted practices as valid. So there was a major schism within the Buddhist Sangha. The more orthodox Westerners became known as Thaviravadins or Theravadins, and Easterners as the Mahasanghikas. So as we have seen from the discussion, the period 6th century BCE saw increasing social, economic and political complexities and growth of hegemonic institutions. We have seen the rise of the states as well as the formation of the caste system and the growth of patriarchal practices during this period. This period was also marked by a prominence of the ideal of renunciation and an intense level of philosophical debates. We must understand that this is the time when the tribal system of operating sort of collapsed, and the kinship structure that held together the society sort of began to disappear, sort of began to wither away. So there were people who did not fit in the new kind of class-based, caste-based and hegemonic states that came up during this period. So we see that a plethora of groups began to roam the Middle Ganga Valley who were not actually part of the new social system. They were free-floating individuals independent of social moorings. And these were the renunciates, the Paribhajakas, as we know from the Pali tradition. And these people were moving about, and at the same time they were moving about in small groups, or there were often lone wanderers. They moved about and they interacted with each other, they debated with each other and exchanged their views and tried to resolve their ideological differences. As we have seen, there were as many as 82, and according to another tradition, there were 60 of such schools who were roaming about in this region. Buddhism and Jainism were two of the most prominent schools, and they are remembered in history because they had established long-enduring monastic institutions. And these monastic institutions were always closely connected with the laity. The Buddhists and the Jains were not isolated from the society. The monasteries were situated in the fringes of the towns, and there was a very close interaction between the monasteries and the wider society. Though theoretically the householder and the ascetic, they represented worlds that were diametrically opposed to each other, and their relationship was of opposition on a theoretical plane. But on the practical plane, there was a very strong basis of mutual dependence from both ends. Because the renunciate was detached from the processes of social production, they were dependent on the householders for their sustenance. And the householders, on the other hand, were showering gifts on the various sects because they thirsted for the kind of new wisdom and philosophy that they generated, as well as for the kind of merit that they promised to mete out if they closely interacted with such sects. To sum up what we have discussed so far, we have gone through the context of the rise of certain sects which were in opposition to the Vedic practice of sacrifices. Then we have seen that there were various categories of such sects. We have mentioned the most prominently the Charvakas and the Lokayatas, who were materialists and were completely opposed to the notion of Vedic sacrifice as well as existence of a soul independent of the body. We have seen the Ajivikas, who had a peculiar theory about about destiny, and they believed that merit or demerit, moral act or immoral act did not matter, and one has to pass through innumerable uterine births to break free from the cycle of life and death. So they completely denied any kind of human volition. As we come to the Jains, we can see that the most prominent feature of the Jains was the strong basis of the organization they built up. Jainism was a very old religion. It proceeded from the time of Mahavira and continued up to the medieval period, and its impact radiated from Eastern India to South and Western India. Then the most important of the heterodox sects was Buddhism, and this was very important because they were in closest contact with the laity, and the practices of the Buddhists were in consonance with the changes that were brought about in the society in that period. And lastly, we can try to understand the kind of impact that these heterodox sects had on early historical period, and it continued up to the early medieval period. And of course, the most important contribution of these sects was the production of historical material like texts that we have in large numbers during that period. For further information, you can log on to the EPG Pathshala website, and all the details are available there.